Okay, I think we're live, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Colleen Medill. I'm at the University of Nebraska. I'll be the moderator today for our teaching tips for new law professors. So I'm going to share my screen now with everyone. We have quite a lineup for people today, and I'm not going to introduce everyone up front. I'm going to have them introduce themselves as they give their presentation. What I'm going to do is to start us off with some basic survival tips for new law professors, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about incorporating skills exercises. So let's take a look at a few survival tips. And I should mention up front that these materials and individual presentations will be made available by West. As you can see, I have a super high-tech presentation here. So, basic survival tips. If you're teaching in the fall, you've already picked a book for a fall, that train has left the station. But what you may not realize is law schools are academic institutions and they operate on quite an accelerated calendar. And so come early October, and this can vary by school, but early to mid-October-ish, you're going to be asked for your book orders for your spring classes. And you may say, hey, I haven't even thought about really my fall class. I'm just getting started, but I wanted everyone to be sure know that that was coming. So you definitely want to be thinking about that so you just don't pick a book, because you've got to meet a deadline in October. One thing I'd highly recommend for everyone is try and attend the AALS annual meeting. If for no other reason than this year it's in San Diego. The dates I've put up here, this is also on the AALS website. One of the best things about that conference, in addition to all the networking you'll do with your subject matter sections, is that all the publishers, but especially West, have large booths there. And so you'll get a chance, they'll have a whole program at the West booth. You can talk with authors. You can look at all kinds of materials. The West representatives are there to help you. And so that's just a great resource. And then finally, keep in mind, Rome was not built in a day. And so you're going to develop a class for the fall, but it's just a start in what hopefully is a really enjoyable career. And your style and your approach to teaching will change over time. And so that's okay. That's really good. It's what keeps the job interesting over time. So a few just really basic things. Designing your syllabus. I didn't used to think about this before COVID, but post-COVID, universities now have multiple mandatory policies that have to go on your syllabus. So don't try and figure this out yourself. You should have an associate dean for faculty. Ask them. What are the mandatory university policies have to go in my syllabus? And can you send me a copy? Or better yet, it's perfectly acceptable to just include a link in your syllabus to the university policy, because the university is updating these things constantly. And that way you don't have to keep revising it every semester. This next point, format conventions, is really about having credibility with the students. You don't want a syllabus that looks really odd and weird and not like everybody else's. So my suggestion is go to a fairly junior, mid-level, and a senior professor at your school and ask them for some sample syllabi. And structure your syllabus so it looks, just like those people, who, especially the one who's been teaching there 40 years, just so you don't look like the outlier to your students. How much can you assign? And now we're getting into scope of coverage. The basic rule of thumb is for a 3-credit hour course, 45 to 60 pages at most per week. If it's really dense material and you're incorporating, things other than pure doctrinal Socratic approach, you'll probably have to cut that down. Pacing is always tricky the first time you do a course. And again, this goes to maintaining credibility with your students. Although you'll want to, and I'll talk about this in point 3, block out your entire semester. You should not release it to the students because inevitably things will change. And there's nothing worse than giving them this great syllabus and halfway through the semester, it's been completely revised. It makes them feel like you don't know what you're doing. So my suggestion would be to just release the syllabus 3 to 4 weeks at a time. That way you can make adjustments as you go along. And if they say, well, why aren't you giving us the whole syllabus at once? You can just say, well, I like to get feedback from the class and, tailor the class to what I see people are interested in. So they'll love that. I use that line every year. As you're designing the syllabus, try and build in a few breaks. And that's where I think when the other panelists talk, you'll get some ideas for things you can do other than the basic read the case, ask questions kind of grind. Today's student is not very good at grinding like that. They want to do things, they want to be hands-on. And so mixing it up a little, I think, helps keep it fresh. And the last thing, and this could be a topic for a 10-hour webinar, your school's going to have an electronic course management system. It could be Canvas, it could be other things. There's all kinds of names, and these are constantly evolving. The main thing is, again, go to your Associate Dean for Faculty and ask for, the buzzword here is instructional design help. Do not try and figure this software programming out on your own. You can get an assistant, and they'll help you with it and show you how to do stuff. So, last thing, and I do have to stay on time myself. How do you tackle a semester's worth of material? Well, my suggestion is try and look at it a week at a time, block out the overview, and then work from there. So remembering the page limits, that will give you a guideline. If you spend a ton of time typing up detailed lecture notes, especially for the first time you teach a class, that's just wasted time. I would suggest do a one-pager outline of the key things you want to cover. If you're using PowerPoint slides and you have like, oh, I have a great question for class discussion, put it in the notes section of the slide, and it'll just be right there as you're reaching that point in the class. One thing you want to be sure and do is double check your school's academic calendar because do you have a fall break? If you teach on Monday and Tuesday and fall break is Monday and Tuesday this year, that's 1 week less of class that you have. So you have to be aware of those. Teachers' manuals can be a very good starting place for preparing your classes. But teachers' manuals vary, and hopefully you picked your books for the fall with the teacher's manual in 9, but if not, it's something to bear in mind when you ask for desk copies, when you're looking at picking books for the spring, ask to see the teacher's manual too. Let's say the teacher's manual has some things in it, but doesn't have any PowerPoint slides. It's perfectly acceptable to email the author directly and ask for their teaching slides. All they can do is say no. If you don't ask, certainly you do not get. Same thing goes for asking any of your faculty colleagues. If you're teaching a section of, say, property, and there are 2 other very experienced property professors, that would be my first go-to. And finally, just wrapping this section up on survival tips. When you go to the AALS conference, you want to make as many new friends as you can, and that becomes your networking group. Those are the people that you can ask for their materials, and if they're very kind, they might give you some of their old exams to help you. The reason I say this, and you might say, well, why are we talking about exams when I'm still trying to figure out the syllabus? Well, your work product deliverable to your dean is a set of grades. And to do that, you have to produce an exam that will withstand, say, a grade challenge by the students. So you have to think about this as you're designing the course. So 2 other little tidbits here, and we could do again another 10-hour session on designing exams. Please know your school's exam and grading conventions. How many hours for a take-home exam is acceptable? What's the grading curve in a first-year course? What's the grading curve in a seminar? What's the grading curve in an upper class course? You do not want to be the outlier, particularly when it comes to grading. And so with that, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about, let's say you've picked your book, but now you're like, maybe I want to try a few skills exercises. Okay, I had straight doctrinal teachers, but I want to do a few skills exercises. My suggestion on this is that you definitely, you start small. Just pick 1 to 3 exercises. Maybe you're going to do 1 in August, 1 in September, 1 in October. How do you get the exercises and what do you do with them? Well, you could spend hours designing them from scratch. Most first-year teachers don't have time to do that. My suggested go-to would be to talk to your West representative. There are all kinds of materials already published out there that you can use. I'll just mention 2 of these. One is the Developing Professional Skills series. That's with West Academic. I'm the author of a book in that series for first-year property. Ellen, who's going to speak later, is the author of a book in the Building Skills series with Foundation Press. So those are just 2 examples of samples. You can ask for desk copies of these and look at them. Finally, 3 more quick points. Students love teamwork, working with a partner. It breaks up the monotony. If you can design something where they work in teams, they love it. A lot of people have questions on, okay, well, what do you have the students do and how do you give them a grade so they put effort into this? I always try and have some kind of deliverable work product. There are all kinds of things in, look at examples and you'll find some things you can have them deliver. And then finally, grading. If you're starting small and simple, you need a simple grading scale. And so what has really worked well for me is I do what I call a high pass fail. I give them an option to redo something that didn't pass for full credit. And I got to tell you, if you fail a couple people, the first exercise, the quality will, with the option to redo for full credit, your quality going forward will really go up. And so those are just a few of my suggestions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And so I'm going to turn the controls over to Miriam Cherry, who's going to talk about teaching with current events. So Miriam, take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Medill. And I want to welcome everyone who's here and say thank you again to West Academic for putting this panel on. And thank you to those of you who are joining us who are new professors. This is extremely exciting, to be part of what I think, just in my opinion, is the best profession and the best job we could possibly have. So really welcome. I'm going to share my screen as well and introduce myself for a minute. So I am the author of a book in the on contracts. So my book is Contracts, a Real World Casebook, and is in its 2nd edition now. Just a little bit about me. I am the outgoing Associate Dean of Research and Engagement at St. Louis University Law School, and I just am joining the faculty at St. John's Law School in New York City. So we're going to be talking today about current events, but I wanted to just take a minute to situate this within the structure that Professor Medill so helpfully set out for us. So I had kind of broken this down into, building and teaching law school courses, which I know is our topic today, into a few components that I know the other speakers are going to be talking about as well. Learning outcomes and assessment, creating the syllabus that we were talking about, working backward from your goals and designing assessments that go along with it to make sure that those goals are achieved. Your content and substantive knowledge. This is something I really got into when writing the textbook and thinking about what your law school requires versus, for those of you who are teaching a first year required course, what's on the bar exam, et cetera. A lot of this information, I think other folks are going to pick up on, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The teaching style is something there's an authenticity to it that I think comes from practice and experimentation, and it takes time to develop classroom management skills and to develop your style. But where I'm going to focus on today is this piece on engaging students and getting students to be active participants. And so we think about active learning, and this is really beyond the, as Professor Medill was calling it, just grinding through or just going through cases and kind of having answers about what that case does. And I think many of the speakers today are going to be taking out aspects of this to talk a little bit more in depth, but that could be working on real world type problems and flipping the classroom. This could be opportunities on your classroom course management system to do things like offering opportunities for bulletin boards or for people to write in with their thoughts or to analyze an issue. I like to do things like play games, have music and other mnemonics in my class. And I've recently discovered, this was just happenstance because of the pandemic, but QR codes are kind of interesting. Students can use their cell phones and then type in things like what they took away from a particular section that you went over, or issue spotting, right? Give them a fact pattern, and then they can pull out the issue, which is something students sometimes really like to have practice with. And there are other things too we could talk about with assessments. It's interesting, the pandemic made me rethink things about assessments. In particular, I wrote up many quiz questions to go along with each unit in my course book, my casebook, because it was something that I realized was going to be helpful no matter what method or how we were doing delivery of the course content, that it would be important. And so I share those with the adopters of my book. But so why use current events? I think there's a number of reasons. You're going to increase student engagement. You want this to be fun for them as well as for you. And it's just more exciting when you see a lot of hands raised here in the classroom. It improves learning outcomes when people are actively engaged in what they're learning, and they want to talk or they're writing about something, or you give them a minute to encapsulate what you just did and put it in writing or in a QR code or something like that. When you're active and actually engaged and have to produce something, you're going to have better quality learning. And I think the last piece, why you wouldn't want to include current events in your class, is it does allow for more diverse and inclusive materials to be used. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute and my philosophy towards that. But I will say, as the other reason for engagement, I think, is because education, this is a quote from William Butler Yeats, but education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. So you want people to get excited. You want people to go out and find things on their own. I have students every year who are sending me news stories, who are sending me information. It's obvious that they've become excited about the material and that they're going out and really have this interest sparked in them in a subject that many of them thought they didn't really know much about it when they started. So that's always exciting. So how do we do this, and what kinds of things, we'll get discussion really going. I will tell you the instance that really got me interested in actually becoming a law teacher was watching a documentary on Nova. This is about 2 decades ago at this point, but there's an ongoing court battle about the ownership of a T-Rex aptly named Sue. It was found on one of the most valuable T-Rex skeletons ever found, and it was found in South Dakota on tribal land. And fossil hunters were paid the landowner about $6,000 to look around. again, quote unquote, look around. And this is a very valuable from a scientific standpoint, but also because it's so rare, very high monetary value, later sold at auction for $10 million. And so this was an ongoing litigation between the federal government, the tribe, the individual landowner, and the fossil hunters who found it. And so the problem in the book asks students to identify various contract defenses that could be initiated here. And I show part of the documentary, students talk about it, and currently the fossils on display in Chicago's Field Museum. There's a lot of ways to kind of get people talking about things that have just happened even more recently than a couple decades ago. In my casebook, I have examples everywhere from, the Megadeth case. They're arguing over a settlement of their various legal issues. The band has broken up and gotten back together several times. Sandra Bullock had a construction dispute with her building a lake house with her contractor. 50 Cent, there was a palimony lawsuit and questions about how finances were being split up, and Lady Gaga split up with her manager in a very interesting accord and satisfaction case. And when students see that these are folks that they know, they really become interested in learning more about what's going on in the materials, and they'll ask a lot of questions and really get engaged. And I'll just give a couple more examples. There was a painting that got destroyed. Banksy's self-destructing painting. Students really love this one. And it's an example that I have in the casebook that I added in from the second edition. I also added in some material about closures due to force majeure clauses. So this is the virus over Broadway is what I call the problem. But these are all like interesting, and people just want to talk about them. And I love talking about all of these examples. But I think the other reason why I really enjoy and have come up with a current events structured casebook is because I do think using things that are in the news, it stimulates people to talk. But it's not just that. I think it also gives a much more rich and diverse set of participants in the course. And that's important, at least in contracts, because much of what you read is back from the time of industrialization. You get discussions of things like an astrolabe and, lost ships at sea. And students today have a bit of a hard time relating to that. So you want to meet them a bit where they live. And the other pieces that I really worked hard in this edition to include materials that will include things like how we got to the racial wealth gap and the role that contract law has placed in that, some critical legal studies, feminist theories of contract to include those perspectives. And that came down to even things like the naming convention. So Bob and Sally, that's a common thing in many case books, just or generic A and B. And I've really gone out of my way to make sure that I was inclusive and ran this past a couple folks in diversity and inclusion, so that this wouldn't just be bolted on, it would be throughout the casebook and would be included. So a couple parting words here from me. I'm realizing my time is running out, and that's important to think about actually when you're teaching things like that. I didn't put that on here, but people staying to their time is important. But as Professor Medill said, you want to examine the teacher's manual. That's a resource available to you. Does it do things like provide briefs with a case? Does it provide sample answers and rubrics? I do provide all these things in my casebook. That's very important to me to have an answer for every question. PowerPoint slides, quizzes, things like that. You want to ask questions, just as Professor Medill said. Finding a teaching mentor, very important. And, ask the author, as she said, most of us really enjoy talking about what we work on. We really enjoy hearing from people who are thinking about it. So I'll leave you with some do's and don'ts here really quickly. So find a teaching mentor and get that textbook that has a good teacher's manual. Experiment, this is supposed to be fun. Try something new, maybe not all at once, not the first time you teach, not, the first day, but have fun with it, and if something doesn't work, it's an experiment. You can always go back. One thing my teaching mentor told me was there's always another day when you can go back, and if the experiment didn't work, you can try it another way. So don't be afraid to have fun and try things out. As far as don'ts, and I think Professor Medill already went over the page ranges and things, I had a colleague who assigned numerous books to his class and then realized as he was assigning them that meant he had to read them all, and you don't read them just, in a way you do as a student, maybe skimming or something. You have to read everything very closely because you're going to get questions about what you assigned. So it means you have to read it too. So, my suggestion would be, stick to what is assigned. And don't ask a question in class that you don't know the answer to. It comes back to making sure your textbook has answers to the questions. You can kind of think through it. Wouldn't just pose a hypo for the first time that you hadn't thought out in advance, maybe with your teaching mentor or a friend, a colleague. And finally, last piece, just as she had said, I wouldn't put syllabus dates because then it just get out of date fairly quickly. But like I said, on the do's, maybe I'll come back to that for 1 second, really do have fun. This really is, like I said, the very best job that you can possibly have. So welcome everyone to what I think is a wonderful profession. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I will pass it over to Deborah Gordon. Thank you so much.
All right, and I'm going to set my timer so I don't go over. My name is Deborah Gordon. I teach at the Drexel University Thomas R. Klein School of Law in Philadelphia. And I teach primarily trust and estates in the first year legal methods course. And I'm also now the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. So I would be the person that many of you would go to for a sample syllabus at my school. I'm going to talk today a little bit, you're going to hear a lot of repetition, which is kind of cool because you'll see in my third slide that I'll get to, a lot of learning is recursive anyway. So hearing the same things in different ways is always a really good way to understand and walk away with a deeper understanding of the topic. So I'm going to talk about assessment and learning outcomes, which is something I didn't really think about as a new law teacher and have started thinking more and more about it as the ABA has challenged us to come up with learning outcomes, but also as I worked on my book for West, which is in the Experiencing series, Trust and Estates, and also during the pandemic, really thinking about the end point, where I want my students to end up at the end of my course and at the end of their law school career. What are the outcomes I want them to work towards? So we know that law students succeed in a lot of different ways. Their learning styles are as diverse as any group of students are, and some really thrive in the Socratic method, and some love to collaborate, and some love to work individually, and then there are others who learn through writing, and there's all different ways that we can challenge them. But the one thing that we know that they have in common is that great teaching and learning is this multi-dimensional, iterative, recursive process where they're making connections all the time. And when you layer and you come back to things in a new and different way, it gets deeper. And the reason I use this picture, not only to show the connections, but the other thing that has become clear to me over the years, transparency with students can be really important. So having them think about or explaining to them why you're doing things the way you're doing them can go a long way. I've learned that even more now that I'm academic dean and I interact with students and faculty in deeper other ways, that students really can benefit from understanding why you've designed a course in the way that you've done it. So not hiding the ball, really being transparent about what your goals are. The other thing is that you may or may not know that the ABA has required all law schools to come up with programmatic learning outcomes, how they want their graduates to, what they want their graduates to do in law school and master before they leave, and has also required law schools to assess ourselves and our students on how well we're meeting our outcomes. So if you haven't seen your school's learning outcomes, that's something to ask maybe your academic dean or your dean of faculty about, because it's useful to see, and they cover all different substance and procedure. And at Drexel, we've adopted these learning outcomes like everyone else has. Some are more general, some are specific. And what I do is in my syllabus, I love to start my syllabus with some quotations, but I then have a section on the course learning outcomes. So this course aligns with the institution's learning outcomes of, for example, analysis and problem solving, and also understanding your role as a professional in serving clients in the profession. And then I have other course specific outcomes. By the time you finish this course, you should be able to read inheritance law cases and the Uniform Probate Code and the Uniform Trust Code critically. You should be able to identify key rules. So fairly general outcomes. And so when I think about designing my course and designing my syllabus, I think about how am I going to achieve those goals? How am I going to chunk those goals? How am I going to achieve them? And so in our textbook, we have at the beginning of each chapter, the outcomes for that chapter. For example, this is an early chapter in the T&E book, and it's about planning for incapacity and the physical act of death. And by the time a student finishes this chapter, they should be able to identify key primary documents that you would use to plan for incapacity. And even if the book you're using doesn't have an outcome at the beginning of it, you can think about the reading you're assigning either by the day, by the week, by the unit. What do you want your students to be able to do or understand by the time they finish that piece of it? And so if you think about what's the end goal for the chunk, what's the end goal for the course, then you can start to think about how am I going to structure the course? What kind of assignments am I going to give that allows the students to master these outcomes, but also doesn't overburden me? That's my balance image. How am I going to ask them to engage in skills? And we've already heard about different ways that, and we'll hear more about ways different faculty do it. But I think about it in terms of very quick, low risk assignments and strategies where feedback can be immediate and not too burdensome on the professor. More comprehensive assignments where there's a little bit more ask on feedback. So that would be in the nature of the high pass fail, where you're reading the submissions, and then a more summative graded series of assessments. So I wanted to give some examples of low risk ways you can interact with your students. And there are so many different ways to do this, but it helps to break up the class. And I do try to do something every class that will give them a break and me a break. And it's amazing when you're in a class of, a big group of students and the energy is sagging. And I always like to teach early in the morning because that's great for me, and the students do not love that. So you feel the energy kind of drift away. And then if you give them one of these moments, you feel the energy build in the class. So it can be as simple as turn and talk, or role play. The person next to you is the client, you're the lawyer. Or I often do a 5-minute writing. I give them something to write about that quotation I showed you on the syllabus. The first day, I ask them to just do 5 minutes, stream of consciousness. Why did I include that quotation? What is this course? What do you think that's about? Or draft a blog post, or I give them will provisions to draft, like we're studying survivorship rules. Just draft one sentence that would go in a will. So it's really short, and then I can give them an example of how I would do it. Or another, I think Miriam just mentioned this, but kind of a ticket out of class or a ticket to class might be a question, something that was raised, that they thought they didn't understand or they had a question about, to either at the very end of class or the very beginning of the next class. All these different really low risk, and you can give immediate feedback, either just to the class or on a discussion board. The more comprehensive assessments might be something like, at the end of that chapter that I just showed you the beginning of, I would give a letter assignment. You're going to draft a letter. It's graded for timely and good faith submission. I give them the option to work in groups or alone. Some students like to work alone. Some like to work in groups. That's true of lawyers. I tell them that, and I let them choose. I limit the groups to 3, and they have to tell me how they all participated. And the questions that I ask them to cover in the letter, I give them a length, but are questions that I want them to understand. So how it matters how property title is held. They have to explain that to a client. Why does it matter how you hold title in the context of estate planning? And then the feedback can be as easy on this as you can give some individual feedback if you like, a rubric, but it's even, you can debrief it in class. This assignment, I asked students, why did I give it to them? Going to that transparency. What did they take away from it? Why would it be? And I also tethered a couple of quiz questions to the substantive pieces that I asked them to address, that what an executor does and why it's important to know how property is titled, then appeared on a quiz later on in the course. So different ways of assessing. And then finally, when I put the whole course together and think about how these pieces fit, because that's the end goal, is like, how is my exam going to assess whether the students have met those initial course outcomes? My exam is 70% of my grade. And then I also have periodic quizzes. I give them every week. They're really short, 5 minutes, 5 questions. So they're very low risk. And then the periodic assessments, like the letter, the chapter assessments. And then I also do a creative writing assignment, which I'm happy to talk to anyone about if they email me, but I don't have time to talk about it here. But that's been really fun. I've done that for the past 5 years, and students have really enjoyed that as something different from law school. So I'm happy to take questions at the end. I think I just made my time limit, and it's really nice to be here and to get to share with all of you. And I'll just echo the idea that everyone really is so lucky to be part of this profession. It's been such a privilege to be a law professor, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
So my name is Billy Sjostrom. I'm presenting on assessments and interactivity. That's how you pronounce my name, Sjostrom. Everyone gets it wrong. I go by Billy. I found some people don't feel comfortable calling a 53-year-old man Billy, and so they call me Bill, even when I tell them to call me Billy, but that's fine. So you can call me Bill, you can call me Billy, whatever you want. Surprisingly, as I think about it, I've been a law professor for 20 years, which is crazy. So that's the longest I've ever had a job by far. I echo what the others say. It's the best job in the world. So I will always be a law professor. I don't think I'll ever retire. I don't see why I'd retire. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, where people move to retire. I already live here. And what do lawyers do when they retire? Oftentimes they teach. I'm already doing it. So don't tell anyone, but I feel like I'm like semi-retired already. Okay, so as you see up here, I teach contracts. That's my 1L course. And then I teach a bunch of business law courses. I don't teach all these courses the same year. We have a 3-course load. So lately I've been teaching contracts, business organizations, and mergers and acquisitions. And then I write in the business law area. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to start off by talking about assessment. So here's the ABA assessment standard that I think it was adopted in 2014. So I started in 2002. I don't think there was an assessment standard before this. I'm not sure. Maybe they amended the existing one. But if you read it, it's not very stringent. In fact, you can get away with the historical or old school model of your assessment consisting of a final exam, because it says right here, law school need not to apply multiple assessment methods in any particular course. And so that's great. It's kind of interesting. Lately, I've been getting professors from other departments at U of A who decide they want to do law school because they can do it essentially for free. And every single one of them asked me, what's the deal with law school only giving one exam? Now, they're not asking because I only give one exam, but a lot of professors at U of A still only give one exam. And I tell them, well, it's easier for the professor if you just give one exam. You only have to grade once. But what I would suggest to you guys is figure out kind of the norms at your school when it comes to assessment. Obviously, from like an educational theory perspective, the more assessment, the better. But at the same time, if your school, if everyone's still in the old mode of, one final, then you don't want to be the person who's loading up your students with tons of what they will view as extra work. So keep that in mind. But these assessment standard is interesting because if you read it, it doesn't really require too much, and a lot of it's up to interpretation. All right, so what I'm going to talk about now is what I do for assessment, just to give you some ideas. And this has kind of evolved over my 20 years of teaching. And so I'm going to walk through the first 3 I'll spend more time on because midterm and final are kind of I give basically a standard midterm and final. But anyway, I do pre-class quizzes. So those are quizzes that the students take after doing the assigned reading. And then we also have videos that I'll talk about a little later before coming to class. And the quizzes focus on, really basic points that I want the students to get in their heads and underscore it before coming to class so that we can hit the ground running. And, the quizzes are easy in that if you watch the video, did the reading, you should get 100%. It'll be something like consideration is, and then there'll be, 3 or 4 different choices. Okay, so that's one piece. I'm a big proponent of doing in-class polls. I've been doing them, I don't know, probably maybe for 10 years, for a while, and for a variety of reasons. I think Deborah mentioned, it's nice to mix things up in class instead of just grinding through cases, which I agree with 100%. And so one way to do that is through in-class polls. I like to use polls to transition from one topic to another. If we're moving on to a new section, then I'll start the section out by asking some basic question about the particular doctrine we're switching to. So it's mixing things up, it's transitioning. The other, perhaps the most important piece is that I will ask polls with respect to doctrine or issues or ideas that I know from my past experience, students always struggle with. So I use them to highlight kind of nuanced areas of law that I've learned through the years that students always get confused about. And sometimes I'll revisit those polls. So that's what I like about polls, because they achieve, multiple different objectives. And originally I used Poll Everywhere as my polling software, but then they like jacked up the price. So lately I've been using something called Mentimeter, which is cheaper. It has less functionality, but it works for my purposes. Like Poll Everywhere, I think now is $300 a semester. I mean, my school would cover it, but I felt bad. And Mentimeter is like $50. There's all kinds of polling software out there now. Yeah, and it's pretty slick. All it requires, it doesn't even require a smartphone. Dumb phones work. Not that you can even buy a dumb phone anymore, probably. But, students just need a phone, a computer, a tablet, what have you. And the nice thing is you display the question in class, students answer on the spot, and then you can display a graph of the answers. And then I walk through, and tell them why certain answers are wrong, and why the one answer is right. And it gives me immediate feedback as to whether they're getting it. Because obviously, if only 20% of the class gets the right answer, and then I'm like, oh, we need to maybe spend a little time on that, a little more time on that. And so that counts as assessment, even though it's less formal. And then I do end of chapter quizzes. Those are included with the book I use. And so that's, I don't have to write the questions, which is nice. And the system through West will keep track of how the students did. Those end of chapter quizzes are more like what you would see like multi-state bar exam section of contract law, certainly more in depth, definitely harder than the pre-class quizzes, but by design. And then I do a midterm, usually 1 or 2 essay questions and then some multiple choice, and same with the final. But when it comes to midterm and final, again, I would ask someone at your new schools what the norms are, because for a while, no one really gave midterms. But then when the ABA passed that new assessment thing, we enacted a requirement where if you teach a small section, and so 1 L year, each student will have one small section, which just means there's 30 students or less. We passed the requirement that the small section had to give a midterm, okay? But, when I taught the big section, I'm like, well, I don't have to give a midterm, I'm not doing it. But then what I found is students complained because they're like, well, I had midterm in my other class. Why isn't Sjostrom doing a midterm? Is he lazy or something? And so that's why, I mean, it's important to kind of know the norms of what's going on at your school, because you kind of want to be within the norms, at least initially. The other thing that was interesting about when I came to U of A, I had like this giant business organizations class. I think I had 120 students. And, I was mentioning to one of my new colleagues, more senior fellow, of how that's going to, be a pain grading that many essays. And he's like, why don't you give multiple choice? I'm like, what? Multiple choice? You guys do multiple choice for your exams? He's like, I've been doing it in common law for 30 years. And so I'm like, okay, I'll do multiple choice then. Because for biz orgs, I felt like it works. But the reason I didn't do it before is at my old school, no one did multiple choice only exams. So again, figure out what the culture is at your school when it comes to those sort of things. One other thing I wanted to mention, and it applies to, I guess, these first 3 bullet points, is whether or not they should count towards the grade. Some years I've counted performance in all of these things towards the grades. Other years I haven't. So, I've mixed it up. The thing is, if it counts, there'll be a lot more arguments with students over ambiguities in the quiz questions, ambiguities in your polls, and ambiguities in the end of chapter quizzes, because their grade is at stake. There'll be, a lot more office hour time spent discussing that stuff, which, that time adds up. Now, from an educational standpoint, I think it's great for students to be questioning the questions, the answers, and all that stuff. And I'm happy to engage with them on it, but it does take up a lot of time. And so it's something to think about, especially your first time teaching. You'll be spending a lot of time prepping. Do you want to add on top of that time discussing performances on these various pieces with students? I don't know. But I just wanted to share my thoughts on that. Okay.
Time, we have a few that give more final thoughts here, Billy?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's mostly it. I got to plug my book. And so, okay. I mentioned
30 seconds, go ahead.
I mentioned the pre-class quizzes and these end of chapter quizzes and the like, that those aren't particularly time consuming because they all come with the book. They all come with the book. We also have pre-class videos that students watch. They take the quiz, they come in there with a lot of the basic doctrine kind of fresh in their minds and hit the ground running. So that's my book plug. But yes, I have another slide, but if I'm out of time, then that's good enough.
All right. Well, Stephen, do you want to take it away?
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to echo all of the welcoming that everyone did in the interest of time. I won't dwell on that. This is a wonderful profession. It's sort of hard to believe that it exists in nature. It's that good of a job. So congratulations on getting a teaching job. I'm going to talk about what's really been neat for me listening to this is how much overlap there is in what we all do. I'm going to focus on one particular aspect of teaching, which I think brings a lot of these thoughts together, but is important to look at separately as well, and that's repetition. The idea here is that repetition is really important to learning, and repetition and retrieval at spaced intervals is particularly important, which means that you come back to things over time as opposed to doing them one time. There's not a lot of research in the in the law school setting, but there's a lot of research on this outside of the law school setting. And they show that if you study something once, you hardly retain it at all. Recalling it once or recalling it repeatedly in one time frame helps. But spaced repetition is hugely beneficial. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. Quizzes turn out to be particularly beneficial in this spaced repetition approach. So I'll show you how I work those in. I'm going to go over a bunch of different ways that I bring in repetition into at least the way I structure my classes. One article, if you're interested in this, is on the slide. It's a really excellent article on, and I got a lot of ideas from it. And at his particular school, they saw a bar passage rate increase of 20%, which is just astounding from employing these practices. Okay, so what do I do? Or how can you do this? Here are the different iterations of the material in the approach I use. So of course you start off with the reading, and then I do what is sometimes called blended or flipped class approach. I take all of my lecture, and I'll show you a very short example of this, not in video form, but how I do it. All of my lecture I pull out of the classroom and provide that ahead of time in videos. I'll show you how that works. I then do, like others, a pre-class assessment, which is just a short multiple choice quiz. At the beginning of class, we do a very short refresher of what we covered from the last class. So again, that's another repetition. And then most of my classroom time is based on hypotheticals. If you use so I teach in the learning series, learning civil procedure. We've shifted from a heavy emphasis on cases to more of an emphasis on hypotheticals and problems, more problems and less complex problems that you can then tweak a little bit as you go on to tease out different things. But whatever your approach, class time is then devoted to those Socratic exercises. Then there is a post-class assessment, a brief recap during the following class, and then finally scaffolding that we've talked about a little bit. So let's take a look at how I use all of those at least. My video, and I really beefed this up when the pandemic came along, we weren't meeting in class for a while. I just took the things I would normally say in terms of content delivery, and I put them on slides, and I don't show my face. I just lecture the way I would have lectured. I keep them short. They're 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes under 10 minutes is ideal. And they have my animations, and I use them to get across the points I want to make about the rules. So I'm taking that out of class time because class time is so precious. Then I have them do a pre-class assessment, which is just multiple choice questions. Mine are more difficult maybe than some of the others. I have them do them before class and then after class. Before class sort of acts as priming. So they read this and they're doing the reading and they're nodding their head and thinking, yeah, I get it. Then they do the assessment and they think, wait a minute, I'm not sure how this works in this context. And then when class comes along, they're listening for the answer for the things that they didn't understand during the multiple choice. And mine are not graded, but they are graded based on timely completion. So you get full credit, even if you get 0 out of 5, you get full credit as long as you've attempted it on time. So you're doing the learning. Okay, so they don't get the answers at this stage. Then we go to class. I start off with a brief recap, and this is like 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, where I cold call on students and have them summarize what we learned from the most recent class. So the example I'm using right now is on joinder, so I would have just covered Rule 12. So I might ask 2 questions: which Rule 12 motions are most subject to waiver, and how are these waived? And I get students to give me these answers just to, again, it's another repetition, another iteration, and solidify their learning. Then I do a very, very short summary of what we're going to be talking about in class. And I do that mostly because students really asked me to do that. They said, if you jump right into hypotheticals, it's sort of too stark and too abrupt. So I give them, again, a 1 or 2 minute overview. We're going to talk about counterclaims here. That's how they work. We're going to talk about cross claims. Here's how they work. And we're going to do impleter claims. Here's how they work. Then almost all of my class time is devoted to hypotheticals or problems. I use The Simpsons. Sometimes if there's a current event, I will bring those in as well. But The Simpsons, I find everyone can relate to that. The students really seem to like that, or maybe they just tell me that to make me feel good, but get positive feedback on that. So I'll put up a problem like this. I then give the students maybe 2 minutes to talk among themselves. That's really helpful to have students be able to talk informally before they have to talk in class. It gives, first of all, everyone a chance to talk about the problem. So they've all got a little bit of an experience. And then when I call on someone, they feel like more comfortable because they've already vetted their ideas with maybe whoever's in their small group. I will then often do informal low-tech polling. So I'll just get a show of hands. Who thinks Sideshow Bob can maintain his cross-claim? Who thinks he can't? And then I use note cards and I will cold call on people to walk through the problem. And I use a lot of illustrations. So I'll put up a slide like this that sort of diagrams the problem. And then as we talked about scaffolding a little bit, or repetition in that sense, even though I'm talking about joinder, I'll bring in subject matter jurisdiction. So first of all, we'll talk about, can Homer even file this claim in federal court? And we'll go through and we'll say, yes, there's diversity jurisdiction. I've used this admission ticket as a sort of a way to illustrate this idea that you needed a claim with original jurisdiction to get in federal court in the first place. Then we'll shift and talk about the cross claim. And so I'll ask what joinder rule might be implicated and call on someone and get them to say 13G. And then I'll ask someone, maybe that same person, maybe someone else, what's the test under 13G? And then we'll work through using facts and analysis. Yes, does this qualify? We'll say, yes, it does. And then we'll say, okay, let's make sure we can bring this. Not only can we maintain the cross-claim under Rule 13, but do we have subject matter jurisdiction for the cross-claim? And we'll say, oh yeah, this qualifies for supplemental jurisdiction. So that's what most of my class time is devoted to. After class, they will then retake the same multiple choice questions. And hopefully now informed by the class discussion, those are graded. Not only, I don't give letter grade credit in the end, but they get their answers. And then at the beginning of class, the next class, I will go over the answer, explain why it's the right answer. You'll see on the left margin, I've shown how many people got it right. I give this for feedback for them so they can understand how they're doing. And I use it for feedback where if 90% of them get it right, I might blow through it. But if they're not so strong on it, I'll spend more time talking about what answers are right and what answers are wrong. And then in addition to those multiple choice assessments, I do periodically give essay or IRAC type assignments. And then this one last slide on this, I use a form of rubric for these assessments that's much more detailed than many rubrics that I have seen. So I will have very detailed issue by issue, rule by rule, fact by fact, analysis, element by analysis element breakout, where I identify each issue and identify points for those issues so that they understand what is required to do well on an exam. And I will sometimes grade them, but I often do peer grading so they can feel what it's like to take someone else's essay and look at this rubric and try to find, did they say this point that they're supposed to make? Did they make it well or well enough? And that is really, I think, constructive for students in terms of understanding how the process works and how grading works. It also does a wonderful thing, which is it essentially eliminates complaining. Because when students come into your office and say, they want to see their exam, and you show them their rubric, and then you can show them, here are the things you got, here are the things that aren't in there. And then instead of complaining, they say, oh, geez, I can't believe I didn't put that in there. How do I do better next time? So it's essentially eliminated complaining for me about grades. I love teaching. I love talking about teaching. I am very happy to engage with anyone. I have a lot of thoughts on a lot of these issues. So if anyone would like to reach out and discuss any of this down the road, I am more than happy to do that. And that's my presentation. Thanks.
All right, great. Ellen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Murphy. I have learned so much during this presentation, so I hope you all have as well. And I'm really curious if those of you who are participants who have done a syllabus before, if you could just raise your hand. There's a raise hand at the bottom of Zoom. I know you can't talk here, but you can just kind of raise your hand. I'm just curious. So, oh, good. Okay, a good number, but some that haven't. I find it overwhelming to start from scratch. And so I wanted to end today by just taking us back a little bit. I remember when I was in law school doing a 50-state survey of Summers v. Tice, which is where the two people shoot the gun. Remember that? And like it hits somebody and they can't figure out who it hit, so they have to allocate liability. And I did a 50-state survey on this. And I remember having all the cases at the top of the library on the floor in the rotunda at the library and thinking, okay, well, I'm done. And then I had to put it all together, right? Which is the piece that you now have to do in building your syllabus. So I have 3 thoughts on that. Before I go there, I am at Wake Forest School of Law. I've worn a couple of hats that are relevant to what we're doing today. I teach legal ethics, professional responsibility, and then also unauthorized practice of law. And I have a West 2 PR books with West and 1 unauthorized practice of law book with West, with a great group of co-authors. I've also served as, I have a Master's of Education in Instructional Design. And so I've served as the instructional design point at the law school, and I've helped, I don't know, built 40 or 50 classes with professors in an instructional design role. So I know how overwhelming it can be. And really, I just have 3 things that I want to say about it. Number 1, use a textbook. And I say that not because West is sponsoring this. There's a lot of pressure these days to go open source, and some of that is arguably legitimate. But when you use a textbook, what you get is curated, vetted content over a period of years, a period of editions that is built in such a way to help students understand the fundamentals. Because in my experience, if they don't get the fundamentals right, then it's all going to go wrong. And the textbook is the place to find those cases, those skills materials, those assessments. So use a textbook. And you're not going to find a textbook that's perfect, right? I am on a textbook with 7 other people, believe it or not. And if we all wrote it ourselves, we would probably write 8 different textbooks, but we bring more to it as a whole. And starting from that is a great place to start. Number 2, don't feel like you have to use the whole textbook. I have never used our entire textbook. And in fact, I started using the textbook that I'm now on at the advice of Lewis Higgins with West in 2011. And since I started, I believe I have taken away each year instead of adding, because I've become more and more convinced that the fundamentals are what the students need, not the exceptional content. So I like to focus on the basics. What I think is really helpful for students, and I've heard a lot of you talk about this, including Stephen in our last presentation, are those additional hypotheticals that cover the basics, because not everybody's going to get it from a single hypothetical. So use a textbook, but don't feel like you have to use the whole textbook. And then the third thing I would say, and we've heard this already today, and that is ask the authors. Colleen mentioned getting PowerPoints. We, on my casebook, we provide teaching mentors to folks. We have syllabi that we share. We share them in various credit hour iterations, because some people teach PR in 2 and some people teach PR in 3. We have learning outcomes, right? And I have met a lot of great folks being a teaching mentor to them. And so I would just encourage you to reach out to the authors. Use a textbook. Don't feel like you have to use the whole textbook, and reach out to the authors. And then just one more thing that I want to say is, if there's an area you feel like maybe you are not an expert in, I mean, there's a lot of areas I feel like I'm not an expert in when I'm teaching, but for example, prosecutorial ethics. I always felt a little overwhelmed by that. No experience in criminal law. So I bring someone in. I either bring in one of my guest speakers or I bring in someone from my school. And having done that now for several years, I've learned more about that content and learned more about how to teach it. And those people, they like being asked as an expert to come in and talk about that which they're an expert in. Now, you may then get asked about to teach in whatever your area of expertise is for one of them, but that can be a lot of fun too. I'm happy to talk through with you what you're doing with your syllabuses or brainstorm things or be of help in any way. I really appreciate being able to join this group and Wes doing this.
All right, well, we said we'd try and keep this to around an hour, and we're at an hour. So I think I'd like to just have I have a few kind of wrap up, kind of finaling thoughts here. So law is very dynamic. Keep it fun. Bring the world into your classroom, as Miriam said. When you design your class, it helps to think about ahead of time, as Deborah said. What do you want them to learn? What are your objectives? And then you can design your reading and your assignments and your assessments with those goals in mind. Like Billy said, sometimes assessments, if you say that to a teacher, they'll roll their eyes and go, ugh, that means grading. I think what you saw today is assessment doesn't necessarily mean grading. There are all kinds of ways for students to test what they're learning and to get feedback, both to them, the polling is a great example, but also to you. Did they get that topic in my post-class poll or did they not get it? And so if you think of assessments as just different forms of feedback, I love the suggestions of have your students talk to each other. Peer grading, I use that all the time. It's awesome. It also makes them appreciate what you go through when you grade. And then Stephen, I think what he showed you was where you could be, where you could go. That was a really advanced form of teaching where you've got everything on video up front. And now you're bringing all of that interaction into the classroom. I loved your slides. I'd ask for instructional design help on some of that. Doesn't hurt to ask. And then finally, as Ellen said, the fundamentals are really the key and less is more. If you start with the textbook, you don't have to use the whole book, but you can start with that. Do your assessments, do your feedback, and then I would suggest if there are parts of the textbook that just aren't working, write some supplemental materials, supplement it yourself. Honestly, that's how I wrote my first textbook. It was an employee benefits law. I used an existing textbook and I just kept supplementing it. And pretty soon when my supplement was approaching the textbook, it's time to go to West and say, hey, I'd like to write a textbook for you. So you can come full circle with all of this. So with that, I think since we said we'd like to keep it to an hour and we're a couple minutes over, we're going to wrap it up. I do want to thank everybody for listening and thank everybody for participating. And if you were just watching a recording or if you had to drop off later, West will make our presentations today available to you. So good luck to everybody in the fall. Take a couple deep breaths and dive in and enjoy the experience. It's really a great, great profession. So that will sign off.
Thank you.
Thanks for your attention, everyone.